Hello and welcome once again to Sibylline Insights. My name is Gareth Westwood, Head of Global Intelligence, and we're recording this from our central London office on Thursday the 23rd of February 2023. On today's episode, Ben Manzin will join us to talk about load shedding in South Africa. Supriya Ravishankar will join us to talk about Pakistan's recent bill on austerity. And Konrad Petraitis will discuss alternative attitudes to the Ukraine conflict in Latin America. Okay, Ben, welcome back to the podcast. Really great to welcome you back.
Pleasure to be here.
I think last month we spoke about the Nigerian elections, and the world's gaze is on Nigeria this weekend, we know, but your desk has been following developments in South Africa, and particularly in regards to power and load shedding. So before we get into the operating environment and what it means for South Africa, can you just explain to us what is load shedding and why do governments use it?
Sure. So basically, where you have too much power demand for the government's capacity to generate that power, you'll need to. What governments sometimes choose to do is through controlled blackouts, controlled power cuts, scheduled, reduce the amount of power on the national grid to basically manage spikes in energy usage and basically deal with the fact that they can't produce enough power for everyone that wants to use it. South Africa has been using this as a tool for, decades at this point. But recently they've been using it more, especially in the last few years, because basically during the administration of the last president, Jacob Zuma, there was an intense period of intense corruption. A lot of contracts that are necessary to Eskom, the national energy utility, went to close allies and friends. And basically, contracts weren't fulfilled properly. Stations didn't get as many coal deliveries as they were meant to get. Maintenance work was done poorly. It wasn't done at all. And so Eskom racked up this huge debt because it had to then pay extra things to get the resources it actually needed. And all the while, its power stations were sort of falling apart, essentially. And so we've got to this point now where you have all this very old energy-generating equipment, which needs to be maintained, and all this investment needs to go into it. And all the while, it's not really working very well. And so, combined with the fact that South Africa's population has grown so much and its energy needs have grown so much, it's now less capable to provide that power because of these systemic problems that are tied heavily to corruption and state capture.
Okay, so load shedding not new to South Africa, but recent years, especially this year, we've seen this extra load shedding, stage 4 load shedding. Stage 6 load shedding, as you described it in a recent report. Okay, so briefly then, what does that mean for the operating environment in South Africa, and how is it being received by the population? Yeah,
so basically there are various, as you alluded to, there are various levels of stages depending on how much power they're taking out of circulation. We've seen the most power taken out, on record basically in these last few weeks. And this can mean power cuts of 10, 12 hours a day. And obviously this is hugely disruptive for people across the entire country. And some companies are able to mitigate its impacts, and some people are able to mitigate its impact by using like auxiliary generators or things like that. But for the vast majority of people, they don't have access to these things, and so it's hugely disruptive to their everyday lives. It means that obviously they can't things at home don't work. They can't store food because food goes bad. Their fridge doesn't work. They can't travel around as easily because everything's congested because the traffic signaling doesn't work. And so, people are fed up and angry about this. And so increasingly we're seeing these ad hoc protests. And now we're seeing opposition parties really start to organize major demonstrations as well.
Okay, so there's political angles involved here with the opposition parties trying to muscle in on this. Are we seeing any widespread organised unrest fermenting then, or is it very sporadic and ad hoc as you describe it at the moment? So
it has been sporadic and ad hoc to date, but we're seeing now the Economic Freedom Fighters of South Africa's kind of radical left-wing party organise a national shutdown on the 20th of March. Now, there have been previous national shutdowns in South Africa's history, and usually they're conducted by South Africa's major trade union movements. And the EFF doesn't really have the trade union connections, and certainly the alliance that is necessary with the taxi federations that move everyone across the country to really conduct a national shutdown. But But there is enough anxiety in the population, and there's enough frustration about these conditions, as well as concern about the potential privatization of Eskom in the future, that they will get enough support from some unions, enough support from people to really, I think, conduct some quite disruptive protests on the 20th of March. Not like people can't go into work or anything like that, but in major cities, you'll see some organised demonstrations, and in those outlying areas, the townships, those less economic suburbs, you will see people try and block roads, which will inevitably result, I think, in clashes with police. So quite a dangerous environment to be around.
So aside from known hotspots then in the population centres, suburbia, especially the less economically well-developed parts of the cities, very difficult environment to operate in for staff and businesses. And going forward, we got the 20th of March. Do we think that will result in any policy reversal, or do we see further disruption, civil unrest, and that cycle going forward?
The difficulty is that really the government's strategy for resolving this in the long term is exactly the kind of policy that the people who are upset about these power cuts don't want to see happen. So you have these economic freedom fighters who, they're launching these protests because, the power structure doesn't work. But they are also vehemently opposed to privatization, restructuring, all these sorts of things, which is one of the strategies the government is considering and has been attempting to pursue for some years now as a way of mitigating Eskom's debt and bringing investment and bringing development back into the sector. And I think the government is going to proceed with that strategy. And in the long term, I think that will, that might reduce the use of load shedding and might bolster its generating capacities. But as we proceed with that, it's actually more likely that we'll see some protests from unions that are upset about this and these kind of factions associated with the radical economic transformation faction in South Africa that will be opposed to these sorts of moves.
So in the long term, then potentially a solution, but there will be some short-term pain as that solution's reached. Well, it was a really interesting report that your desk issued yesterday on this. And of course, we'll be looking out for further products as we go into March and beyond. But for now, thank you so much for joining us, Ben, once again.
Happy to be here.
Well, Supriya, welcome to Sibylline Insights. It's a great pleasure to welcome you. We're going to talk about Pakistan today. And in particular, as we're recording this morning, the Pakistani government have proposed a bill that will pave the way for IMF funding, we hope. However, there are strings attached and implications, as we've talked about over the last few weeks. Before we get to that, though, can you just put us in the picture? How did we get here?
Yeah, thank you, Gareth. So Pakistan's economy has always been heavily reliant on financial aid from a lot of different partners, including the IMF. The IMF has given about 22 different bailout packages in the past. And there was a time where during the American war on terror, a lot of the funding came from the West. So there's no denying that Pakistan has never actually seen full economic potential by standing on its own feet. But particularly last year, because of two main reasons. The first is the war in Ukraine, which really led to a balance of payment crisis, particularly because of energy imports. And second, the floods, which led to 30 billion in damages hitting key industries like textiles and agriculture, which are very important for exports. Pakistan's economy has really reached a position of breaking point. So that's where we really are today.
So the bill announced this morning then, quite a few strings attached. Pakistani government hopes that this will lead to substantial funding from the IMF. But can you just briefly take us through the measures that are proposed in the bill?
So a lot of measures included in this bill involve scaling back of taxes and increasing tariffs on imports. So this would include a GST tax. That means a higher tax on goods like fashion items that are imported from abroad and other luxury goods like mobile phones. So there's a solid disincentive to make sure people don't spend a lot of money on foreign goods. But there's also a lot of austerity measures included on the government itself. For example, cabinet ministers will no longer get salaries, for example. And there's a bit to try and reduce all sort of government expenditure, including on security, which could be a serious issue. So yeah, the bill definitely comes with a set of strings attached. And it's important to note that an IMF bailout, which is quite possible if this does go through, is ultimately also a loan, which means that will have to be repaid. So while the bill in the short term could be a life jacket, in the long term it could actually be, it could spiral into something much worse.
And you mentioned this is a loan. Of course, we've also seen Pakistan take an additional loan from China recently. Can you just briefly explain what all that's about?
So the China Development Bank agreed to a 700 million USD loan, in a sense, which is actually a condition that the IMF required for them to go ahead and give this bailout package. So it's part of that, in a sense. But this makes China an even bigger player in terms of its space in Pakistan. Pakistan already owes it around 30 billion in debt. That's around 1/3 of the total foreign debt owed by Pakistan to other countries, and a lot of that is a part of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, or CPEC. Which has resulted in a lot of domestic dissatisfaction. We see a lot of that emerge in Balochistan, where we have groups like the BLA that are very anti-China. So it's not great in the sense that it may again lead to it may snowball into something much bigger, but in the short term, it's, I guess, what the government has to do in order to secure its position.
And, Pakistan's got a history of civil unrest, especially in response to measures such as described in the bill. So what do we foresee in the short and medium term now as a result of this bill that's been ratified this morning?
Yeah. Well, it's come at a really terrible time with inflation as high as 27% in January last month. So it's definitely not come at a time where people want to be paying more taxes, so to speak, going into the future. And there is obviously a lot of dissent with the current government, because there's Imran Khan, who is trying to topple that government through a protest movement. Well, to a large degree wasn't very successful, but is now picking up once again. So it's not coming at a good time, and that's definitely going to spook investors. It's going to reduce confidence in the market. We can probably see that in terms of bonds and see that show in other ways. But definitely it raises the risk of domestic unrest when things like the cost of petrol goes up, when it hits your stomach, when it's everyday lives being impacted at a time when the government doesn't have the best majority either. It definitely raises the risk of unrest.
So a perfect storm that could lead to a very difficult operating environment in the country over the short, medium term. A plethora of risks there. I'm sure we'll enjoy reading about them in audio reporting, but for now, Supriya, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Konrad, great to have you on the podcast. A warm welcome. We're recording this on the eve of the Ukrainian invasion anniversary, and today we're going to explore some attitudes in Latin America towards the conflict. Now, a lot of countries we've observed in the region have changed their stance since the conflict began. Can you explain roughly where we are with that? Is this a developing trend that you're seeing, or are these one-off political positions?
Yeah, Gareth. So at the start of the conflict, there were more or less 3 countries that had an overt position supporting Russia. That would be Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua. And then the vast majority of all the other countries were very public in their support for Ukraine. That has changed a little bit in the past couple of weeks. We've seen the vast majority of countries return to what I would say is the historical mean, more non-interventionist stance in the region. And we've seen that shift. We don't expect that shift to reverse anytime soon.
So what's driving the separation with ostensibly Western, US, EU positions then? What's driving the rift?
So the short answer is the Ukraine and Ukrainian allies have started to ask for stuff, more tangible support. So the US unveiled this proposition. They would exchange more or less Russian weaponry in Latin America for more modern US weaponry. All countries said no to that. And then Olaf Scholz had a very high-profile trip just around the southern cone. He visited Brazil, Argentina, Chile. And I believe the only tangible outcome of that little meeting was that he got some demining expertise from Chile. So, yeah, the wider trend right now is very much driven by the fact that they're starting to ask for more tangible support.
So what are the consequences then, particularly for Ukraine and Russia? Are there any consequences to this shift?
You could argue there are some real consequences. So Latin America has historically been a very large buyer of Russian weaponry. Argentina, Brazil, Ecuador, Colombia all have large stockpiles of Russian weaponry. Peru, in particular, has both MiG and Sukhoi jets that are operational that they could trade in for American weaponry. But again, all those countries have very much said very politely, no thank you. Returning back to the historical mean. So you could argue that they could have somewhat, in the near term, a little bit of an impact on the ground.
So, I mean, diplomatically then, do the US, EU, UK have any sway? Are we going to see any response to this from the West, essentially, towards Latin America to try and get them to, I don't know, change tack?
So there's strength in numbers at the moment. Latin America, as I said, has historically been non-interventionist, especially during the Cold War. They try to play both sides of against each other in a lot of respects. And the only real tool that the US or the UK or the EU, for that matter, have is sanctions. So the US and the EU, you can see in the graphs in our latest report, the amount of sanctions that have gone up in 2022 have been historical. We've never seen this amount of sanctions being institutionalized, being rolled out by these two jurisdictions, as we've seen in the past year. You can see them grow 2, 3, 4 times over.
And these are sanctions against what, Latin American?
No, these are sanctions against both Russian and third-party countries. So right now, sanctions haven't really touched Latin America, which remains a very large buyer of Russian products, specifically fertilizers. But there's no evidence to suggest that those sanctions won't start to impact the wider continent.
Sure, and that's, I think, what I want to delve into finally.
Yeah.
You touched on it there. Latin American firms that might be doing trade with Russia, for example, what are the impacts for Latin American firms? Have we seen any impacts already as a result of the sanctions, for example?
Not necessarily. A lot of firms have not decoupled from Russia. This is in large part because Russia is one of the largest suppliers of fertilizers, of grain. Both supply chains are very much interlinked, and to execute a decoupling, like we saw a lot of countries in Europe have done over the past years, it would cost a lot of political capital in the region. I would say that. So that would be for the politicians, but for the firms, they just haven't been pressured. There hasn't been that public pressure or that political pressure to go ahead and remove themselves from those relationships.
So what, do we have some Latin American firms that are essentially at risk of breaking sanctions and they're just carrying on, or?
Under the current environment, yes, they would be very much at risk of breaking sanctions. I think if you asked them a year ago, they would not have said that. But firms producing dual-use technology, for example, firms supplying agricultural equipment or just raw materials, yeah, you could argue that they'd be breaking sanctions, especially if those end products end up in front lines.
So given this very complex environment, there's surely reputational risk to firms in that case?
Indeed. So there's several lists out there of firms that continue to do business with Russia. One of the most famous ones is one produced by Yale University. They currently list 2 Mexican large firms in there. They rated, I think they rate them 1 to 5. Both of them are rated 5. And then you can see Latin American companies starting to permeate and be introduced into those firms, into those lists. So yeah, we can expect that to be a developing trend moving forward.
So a really complex trade environment then, and the political stance by the Latin American administrations potentially have a real impact on firms that deal with Russia. I know it's something that your desk are very keen on monitoring at the moment, and you've pushed out a number of reports, and we look forward to reading more of them to inform us in the future. But for now, thank you very much, Konrad.
Thank you.
Well, that's it for another edition of Sibylline Insights. Thank you to Ben, Supriya, Konrad, and thanks to you for joining us once again. We look forward to welcoming you to the next episode, and please do remember to like and subscribe.